June 1945. World War II in Europe had been over for a few weeks. The Germans stood in the ruins of their country. Nothing was as it had been. No one knew what was to come. In destroyed Hamburg, a US Special Forces unit took film footage of the city's rubble landscapes.
Hamburg had been blackened by fire. The rubble images exerted a tremendous fascination on people of all nations. The soldiers liked to take pictures of the rubble, but so did ordinary Germans. There were painters who pulled easels into the rubble and painted those pictures as if they were picturesque Roman ruins. Many people liked to look at the rubble, because it was perceived as a reflection of the inner self. Just as one's own ego, one's own morals and one's own value system lay in ruins, so also the world lay reflected in the ruins. They saw in the ruins their own condition reflected, and actually couldn't get enough of it.
The ruins were to shape the lives of the people of Hamburg for decades to come. In what remained after the war, the survivors desperately tried to get by, for themselves and their families.
The rubble was piled up and paths were made, and at least there were no more bodies lying around. But the city as such was dead. The situation in Germany after 45 was very confusing. It was relatively easy to go underground. It was relatively easy to disappear if you wanted to.
The chaos provided an opportunity to commit crimes almost without leaving any traces.
Incredible mountains of rubble landscapes which could still be seen in the city of Hamburg well into the 1960s. There was an area of several square kilometers that wasn't even cleared, couldn't be cleared, but around which a border was simply drawn, that is, a wall was built. And this area was a restricted area and couldn't be entered. That's also where one of those bodies was found from the so-called rubble murders.
In 1947, a series of murders shook the city. The victims were nameless, unknown, one of many unsolved crimes of the first post-war years. In Hamburg, the Second World War ended on May 3rd, 1945. In the afternoon, British troops marched into the Hanseatic city. After realizing the hopelessness of their situation, the people of Hamburg surrendered their city to the Allies without a fight. At City Hall, British Brigadier General John Michael Sperling was officially given command of the city. There was peace, but the victorious powers now faced a daunting task.
In the early summer of 1945, after the unconditional surrender, there was great chaos in Germany. Between 12 and 15 million displaced persons had to be accommodated and provided for. The state administration had virtually collapsed and was only functioning in small areas through self-organization. The local population also had to be provided for, and that in a state where, for example in Hamburg, 80% of the living space was so damaged that it could not really be used, and the entire infrastructure was collapsing. That led to people disappearing, going into hiding, families being torn apart. And it seems that many people were drawn to the big cities because they thought it's still easiest there to be taken care of, to find work, maybe to find relatives again.
Hamburg was also filling up, with returning evacuated residents, refugees, displaced persons. They sought shelter among the ruins and faced an uncertain fate. Edith Peter was 21 years old and hoping for a better future.
Das war eigentlich trostlos.
It was so bleak. The rubble was piled up and paths were made. And at least there were no more bodies lying around. But the city as such was dead. Everyone was grateful that no more bombs were falling. But everyone believed it had to go a little faster with the reconstruction. But with what?
Mit dem Wiederaufbau, aber wovon?
The people had been left with nothing. Even during wartime, the supply situation had been difficult. For years, they'd been living with shortages and hardship. The struggle for survival continued even in times of peace.
Many people really starved to death because the supply of ration cards, for example, first had to be built up by the Allied administration. The entire Allied administration had to be set up in the first place, had to look into things in the first place. Who was actually there, and who do we actually have to provide for?
In the Hanseatic city, the British military administration was responsible for this. An optimal distribution of resources among the population was to be provided by ration cards. Edith Peter received special rations because she was pregnant with her first child.
We got something to eat, not much, but it was enough. The English took good care of it. The English were distant, yes, so they had absolutely no connection or no private. They had orders.
Die Briten waren sehr, sehr beliebt, weil sie die Nachsicht.
The British were very, very popular because they were the most lenient occupiers. The British had the least interest in real denazification. They also didn't believe that it could succeed. Which led to the fact that at the end of the war, quite a few high-level Nazis flocked to Hamburg because they thought they would get away better from there. There was a Berlin woman who noted in her diary that she went to Hamburg for a visit and was shocked at how openly pro-Hitler statements were made in the streetcar. And she says that no one in Berlin would have dared do that.
Along with Berlin, Hamburg was one of the cities worst hit by the bombing. Thousands were homeless. The British had makeshift homes built to alleviate the worst of the hardship.
Houses still standing and in reasonably good shape were often requisitioned by the Allied occupying forces, and the rest had to look where they could for accommodation, which led to extremely cramped conditions, and to the fact that people had hardly any privacy, really. Whole families living in one room, but then they were still happy, also in garden sheds and so on. So anything that was in any way habitable was used.
Often, strangers were accommodated together without being asked. No one knew who they would meet. The war had mixed people up and thrown them together again. Many had been severely scarred by the suffering of the past years. Above all, the bombing raids in the summer of 1943 had traumatized the people of Hamburg. Operation Gomorrah, planned by British forces, ignited a firestorm in the city that lasted several days.
I lived with my parents in Eppendorf on Breitenfelder Straße, on the third floor, and that's where the incendiary bombs fell on the night of July 25th. Unfortunately, we had no water, and that's why we couldn't extinguish the fire, and it started burning from above. My father was on air raid protection duty in the town hall. He wasn't there. The stairwell burned very quickly, and we could only watch from outside, from below, how one floor after the other burned down.
Desperately, Edith Peter tried to save something of value for the family from the flames.
I then went up again, and in the back where my children's room was, everything was already gone. The whole façade was down, and the rooms at the front were still standing. It started to glimmer like that. I had a suitcase still standing there, where I had packed all the handicraft things, and I took the suitcase and tipped them out. And then my mother said to me, "Don't make this place so messy." And everything was on fire. So I put the drawer with the silver into the suitcase. But then we had to go downstairs in our nightgowns because the flames were coming. And, well, as I said, the so-called silverware, that was the only thing.
Like countless others, Edith Peter lost virtually everything in the inferno. In the morning, she tried to make her way to her fiancé, later husband.
Mein Mann war dann in Wuppertal.
My husband was a battalion commander in Wuppertal. I knew it was possible to go there, so I tried to make my way. As far as the main station, I can tell you every step I took about dead people in the Hohe Luftchaussee and burning beams.
Brennende Balken. Von da fuhren Züge.
Trains went from there. And then I went to Wuppertal and was able to stay there, in the barracks, where I was the only female among 1,200 soldiers. But Wuppertal was also broken. They'd suffered attacks there just 4 weeks earlier.
The horror of war dulled most people. When survival was the only concern, the standards of morality and decency began to shift.
Everyone had experienced it, the horrors of war, the bombings. What one can certainly determine of the general psychological state of the population at that time is, as one would certainly put it today, a traumatization, which at that time could not yet be put into words. And that, combined with narrowness, with hardship, that is, really existential hardship, already led to the fact that law and order were respected less and less. Everybody went on hoarding sprees. Everyone went out stealing coal. Suddenly they were committing theft. And that, of course, did something to the self-image of these people, who before hadn't seen themselves as criminals.
Edith Peter and her husband returned to Hamburg. They saw petty theft as a necessary evil.
Mein Mann war sehr besorgt.
My husband was very concerned about his young wife, and then did everything he could. A man up for anything. He had stolen a lot of coal between Darmtor station and Sternschanze. This activity mostly involved them driving past slowly every evening until they could bring a full bag home. That was not reckoned to be anything bad.
Das hat man nicht empfunden als was Böses.
What then became difficult, however, was if you wanted to distinguish yourself from real criminals, who of course also existed. There were people engaging in black market trade on a grand scale, and there was also normal criminality, including violent criminality.
In the spring of 1947, over a 4-week period, 4 bodies were found in the Hamburg rubble. On January the 20th, children playing in Baustraße discovered the body of a girl about 18 years old. 5 days later, scrap metal collectors in Eimsbüttel found another dead body, aged about 65. A week later, a child of about 6 was found. And finally, on February the 12th, a woman of about 30. What they had in common from the start was that it wasn't possible to ascertain the identity of the victims.
Die werden nacheinander gefunden auf Trümmergrundstücken beziehungsweise das Kind in einer.
They were found one after the other in different derelict areas. The child in a burnt-out factory, a former mattress factory, all strangled and all also stripped. And then one began with the investigations. Of course, crime scene photos were taken, sketches were made, witnesses were questioned. But some of them were also found naked, unidentifiable, not recognizable in essential parts, even from their faces. There were few clues.
There were virtually no traces at the sites where the bodies were found. The 4 dead bodies left an impression of neatness. Not a worker's hands, a note said. What was striking was that the victims were strangled professionally with a wire noose or cord, the investigators suspected. Even an alignment with the missing persons file did not help in identifying the bodies.
First of all, the police offered a reward of 5,000 Reichsmark. That wasn't much for that time. But then it got interesting. At the beginning, 1,000 cigarettes, then afterwards the number increased, up to 5,000 cigarettes. And if you were to give a value to a cigarette at that time, then you'd have to put it, according to today's euro, to approximately upwards of 9 euros, you could say. If I then offer 1,000 cigarettes, or later maybe even 5,000, then of course that's an enormous value. But even that didn't lead to any breakthroughs.
It has to be understood that the work of the police was made more difficult by the fact that even the most basic things were often not available in the post-war period.
The city landscape was characterized by the destruction that the entire city had suffered, where you can say that basically half of the city was destroyed, and logically also half of all the offices. Some of the offices were relocated to the building at Karl-Muck-Platz, a high-rise building. Some of the technology could be saved, and that's why the laboratories were actually in quite good condition, relatively good by today's standards. What was missing was all the material. It started with paper, ink ribbons, typewriters, and things like that.
The material equipment of the Criminal Investigation Department improved only slowly. 1 year after the war, the Hamburg police at least had radio again, as the newsreel Welt im Film reported.
Die deutsche Polizei in der britischen Zone hat jetzt zur besseren Verbrecherbekämpfung wieder ein Funknetz erhalten. Schnellwagen mit dem neuen Empfangsgerät in Hamburg. Ein Verkehrsunfall. Der schuldige Fahrer versucht zu entkommen. Meldung zur Befehlszentrale.
An 3 Peter und 5 Peter. Millantor, Verkehrsunfall. An alle Wagen. Verkehrsunfall Millantor. Fahrerflucht. Opel-Limousine.
Olivgrün beschädigt. Flüchtet St. Pauli, Stephansplatz, Hauptbahnhof. Wagen vermutlich gestohlen.
Die Streifenwagen nehmen die Verfolgung auf. Der flüchtige Fahrer wird eingekreist und verhaftet.
In the case of the Rubble murders, the fact that the 4 dead bodies had been found in the coldest winter of the century made things even more difficult for the investigation department's forensics team. The thermometer dropped to -20 degrees, and the supply situation for the people of Hamburg became precarious. There was hardly any fuel left.
We didn't know how we were going to keep warm. Then my husband got a wagon load of wood from a former comrade. One of us had to guard it when it was unloaded, because some people wanted to profit from it. And then he brought it into the cellar. And that way we were able to heat at least one room.
Dadurch haben wir dann wenigstens einen Raum heizen können. Und ein Nachbar von uns, der war auch ausgebombt, der hatte auch
One of our neighbors was also bombed out. He also had a room in Rotenbaumchaussee, a few houses away, and the ceilings there were very high. And he built a shack in his room, brought boards from the rubble and collected them. And then he built himself a real little house with door and window and roof, 2 by 3 meters. And then he needed very little heating.
So 2 mal 3 Meter, und da brauchte ja dann ganz wenig Heizung.
And we had 4 to 5 people from the neighborhood visiting every day who just wanted to get their hands warm for an hour. That was terrible. The freezing was worse than starving. At least that's how I felt.
Habe ich jedenfalls so empfunden.
Donations and soup kitchens helped children especially to survive the catastrophic cold.
Meine Großtante, die bekam jeden Mittag.
And my great-aunt got soup every noon at St. John's Church. And she always went with the baby in the stroller and got the soup. And with the soup, there was a little white roll. And this baby got this roll. And as they turned with the baby carriage from Rotenbaumchaussee into Turmweg, this child was already screaming, "Be back, Rusk!" Because she knew for sure she was going to get one of those special treats. That was quite helpful.
The German and Swedish Red Cross in particular made an effort to care for the people. Nevertheless, countless deaths occurred in this post-war winter.
In those years of hunger, to also experience this horrible cold, that was the end for many. For how many, one doesn't know exactly. One speaks in the historiography of some 100,000. Of course, this is so crude and shows that they simply stopped counting the corpses, and they were somehow disposed of, piled up at the edge of the cemeteries because the earth was much too hard to put them in the ground. And you can imagine that there were also many who died violently. There was simply no more attention paid to the individual in this winter of hunger.
Kann man sich vorstellen. Also da wurde einfach nicht mehr auf den Einzelnen geachtet in diesem Hungerwinter.
Were the murders of the 4 unidentified people robberies motivated by greed? Were a few pieces of clothing or ration cards worth a human life that winter?
You have to assume a very, very high number of unreported cases, because it was very easy to simply conceal acts of violence in the post-war period as well. You can say that a human life was not worth much, but the fur coat that the victim was wearing may have been more valuable. Nevertheless, it must be said that acts of murder attracted attention. There was a lot of interest among the population when such things appeared in the newspapers, for example, or when wanted posters were put up. That interested people. That was still sensational. So that was not an everyday thing.
In the meantime, newspapers were calling for people to walk only in the middle of the street so as not to fall victim to an ambush amidst the ruins. Despite doubling the reward to 10,000 Reichsmark, the police received hardly any tips.
The reward was relatively attractive. There was also hope in it. Yet it was also the case that people were confused by so many unanswered questions. Does anyone know him? Am I looking for a he or a she, or for men missing in action? And there were an incredible number of posters around, all in different places, and could one really study them in any detail? And if I then didn't have any reasonable photos, and that was also the case in this case, if you can't recognize my facial features precisely, then it's very difficult. If we now assume that we are really dealing with a family of 4 people who may have come from East Prussia, or from Silesia, or Upper Silesia, or from Pomerania, where should the data be?
Were the murder victims displaced persons? Since the end of the war, German populations had been forcibly resettled from Eastern Europe, sometimes under brutal circumstances. At least 12 million people had been affected by flight and forced emigration, but hardly anyone in their new homeland was interested in the hardships they'd suffered.
The displaced persons were not welcome, partly for quite objective reasons. The cities were destroyed, there weren't enough apartments, there wasn't enough to eat, and then new people came in. And what's interesting is that they were perceived as strangers, as a pack of gypsies, as they said, as 40-kilo gypsies, as Polacks.
Although they were of German origin, in many places they were met with contempt from their fellow countrymen.
And that had one positive result, namely that the idea of a so-called folk community, die Volksgemeinschaft, which had been so fetishized under fascism, turned out to be pure illusion. It dissolved into thin air. It virtually imploded. There was no question of a national community at all. Instead, people suddenly turned their attention to regional identity. The Bavarians feared for their Bavarian identity because of the refugees from the east. The Frisians feared for their Frisian identity, and so on. In this respect, the Germans had a kind of multicultural experience with themselves. But it had its positive side in that it wasn't possible to build a new nationalism on this divided foundation. Being German, the German national community had proven to be a pure illusion.
Die deutsche Volksgemeinschaft, die hatte sich als pure Illusion erwiesen.
The Hamburg investigators also submitted photos of the murder victims in the camps of displaced persons and former forced laborers, but to no avail. They were getting nowhere, even though their forensics were among the best in the country.
Die Kriminaltechnische Anstalt in Hamburg ist eines der fortschrittlichsten und erfolgreichsten wissenschaftlichen Detektivinstitute in Deutschland. Oft sind es nur Kleinigkeiten, die zur Ermittlung eines Täters führen. Ein wichtiger Helfer dabei ist die Chemie. Von der gefälschten Lebensmittelkarte bis zum ausgelöschten Wäschezeichen gibt es nichts, was Mikroskop oder Analyse nicht enthüllen können. Ein zentraler Schusswaffenerkennungsdienst klärt alle Fragen, die mit Waffen und Geschossen zu tun haben. Und alle Ermittlungen des kriminalistischen Laboratoriums sind unwiderleglich.
Hamburg's Criminal Investigation Department quickly earned a national reputation. This was also because the British military administration recruited extremely capable personnel after denazification had freed Hamburg's police force from numerous National Socialists.
The police leadership was taken over, in Hamburg at any rate, by those who had made good, in quotation marks, or had made good later. Bruno Georges had been dismissed by the National Socialists in Hamburg in 1933, and then other executives joined him at the end of 46, the legendary Karl, known in his circle of friends only as Kudel or Cuddly Breuer. Also a police officer from Hamburg, a first lieutenant, also dismissed by the National Socialists in 1933. And Breuer then became head of the Criminal Investigation Department, and he succeeded in working up the Criminal Investigation Department really quickly and professionally, so that it really gained a legendary reputation at the time.
Inspector Paul Ingwersen, who investigated the Rubble murders, was also a so-called restorer. He had refused to divorce his half-Jewish wife during the Nazi era and had been dismissed by the Nazis. But not all of his colleagues were without political baggage.
What's always interesting about breaks in police history during both World Wars I and II is that the experts, the specialists, always come off, so to speak, surprisingly well, going along with the saying, yes, I was only a homicide detective, I only worked on murder cases. At the time, people were happy to believe that, and far too happy. And yes, I had nothing to do with anything. When you later looked at the files, you became frightened and anxious about the people who continued to be on duty, due only to making these kinds of statements. People who, of course, should have been dismissed long ago.
The British put many of the Nazi regime's accomplices on trial. In the courthouse in Hamburg, for example, the guards of the Ravensbrück concentration camp went on trial. But other Nazi crimes were also tried there. Newsreels and newspapers reported on the trials.
After all, we actually knew many of the people who were locked up. Aha, now it's his turn. You read in the newspaper about people you knew. I know of a classmate and friend of mine whose father was a very dedicated Nazi. And at his children's birthday parties, we were not allowed to say, "Good day, Mr. Trent," but had to say, "Heil Hitler, Mr. Trent." And, well, that they then got hold of him and sentenced him, that was closely followed in the newspaper.
But not just a few managed to go underground and slip through the cracks of the justice system. Many crimes went unpunished.
These were British military courts that focused on crimes here during the war, and they investigated very intensively. There were still many testimonies respecting the murder of prisoners on these so-called evacuation marches. Bergen-Belsen played a major role. Neuengamme, Fuhlsbüttel concentration camps. This was pursued very intensively. The punishments were very severe, but appropriate. However, one thing must also be made quite clear. This may sound a bit cynical. Anyone who was not available during this phase didn't have to expect they'd be sentenced later on. So everyone still knows Karl Kaufmann, who was portrayed completely incorrectly, who was not just the Gauleiter, but one of the outstanding National Socialist personalities. Also Richter, the police senator, who also didn't get focused on in any way at the time. And then, once it was handed over to the German judiciary, you have to get quite angry, because the prosecution of these people really stalled for many, many years.
Were the murder victims witnesses who were put out of the way so as not to become a danger to a Nazi criminal?
There were networks and associations of SS members, the Gestapo, the police, who were all in contact with each other, giving each other tips, making agreements before trials, or even before interrogations, along the lines of, "I'll say this, what will you say?" This is all proven in many cases, and that there were threats, of course, along the lines of, if you say anything, then you have to expect that. There was all that kind of thing.
Those who didn't cover it up had to suppress their own individual guilt for the catastrophe into which the Nazi regime plunged the world. There was no place in German post-war society for its true victims. The majority wanted to look forward after years of terror and deprivation.
Auch die Deutschen, die über Jahre hinweg Hitler begeistert.
Even the Germans who had enthusiastically cheered Hitler for years had experiences with the Nazi system in the last months of the war when they really got to know the Nazis. Those who knew that the cause was lost and who wanted to take as many of their fellow citizens with them to their deaths. Suddenly, the Germans also felt themselves to be victims of the Nazi system.
Opfer des NS-Systems empfunden. Das führte dann dazu, dass
As a result, people no longer even bothered to think about the years in which they'd given their approval to the Nazi system, but believed the matter had been atoned for through the bombing, through the evacuation, and through the tough last months of the war and the post-war months.
letzten Kriegsmonate und Nachkriegsmonate hätte man die Sache eigentlich ausgesühnt.
Die britische Aktion Seemöwe brachte bis Mitte Oktober 8000 deutsche Kriegsgefangene aus England in die Heimat zurück. 700 wurden nach Berlin, 2000 nach der amerikanischen und der Rest nach der englischen Besatzungszone entlassen. Das englische Urlauberschiff
After years of hardship and captivity, those returning home expected recognition and an appreciative welcome.
zum ersten Mal wieder auf deutschem Boden.
But their expectations were often disappointed.
Und wohin geht's jetzt nach Haus? Jetzt fahre ich nach Neumünster, Schleswig-Holstein. Und da steht die Mutti dann schon im Türrahmen, nicht? Ich will es hoffen, sie hat schon so kleine Ahnung. Denn wir standen ja im Briefverkehr und hat sich schon mit gerechnet, dass ich Ende September wohl kommen würde.
Das Heimkehrerschicksal ist in vielen Fällen schon ein echtes Drama. Man muss sich das so vorstellen.
In many cases, the fate of the returnee was a real drama.
Dem Krieg herbeigesehen.
You have to imagine that people naturally longed for their husbands to return from the war. And because of that, the disappointment was all the greater when he actually did show up at the door, and in many ways couldn't cope with the situation. During the last months of the war, women had become almost forcibly emancipated. They'd learned to make their own decisions and to master life. They'd learned to improvise, had formed survival communities together with their children.
Ihren Kindern zusammen Überlebensgemeinschaften gebildet. Und nun
And now the man comes home and wants to be the master of the house again. But it just wasn't possible. Because you couldn't get anywhere in this post-war chaos with soldierly qualities. In this respect, the women and children were much cleverer. And they didn't want to be told what to do anymore. The man reacted accordingly, aggressively, disappointed, frustrated, jealous. In many cases, they were ill, marked by captivity, especially if they'd come from the Russians, had hunger syndromes, were enormously depressed, and were a drain on the pockets of their families. In this respect, in many cases, the return of the men, which was actually longed for, turned out to be fraught with disappointment.
In many cases, the men were by no means as eagerly anticipated as they had hoped.
The families had been partly destroyed, and now perhaps the husband comes back from captivity, realizes, oh, there are more children than I actually remember. But I was not at home for a few years. And then the wife explains, well, we didn't really expect you anymore. And then, of course, there are countless conflicts.
Were the murders an act of jealousy? Were the victims perhaps even related to each other? Was it all about a family quarrel?
There's a lot that points to a family conflict, possibly, because the whole family seems to have been affected and disappeared without a trace. And that, I think, is another indication. I think there's a high probability that it could have come from that direction, because the acts also occurred very closely together, and after all, over a relatively short period of time. So it may well have been a family dispute.
But not one of the victims could be identified. Not even the 6-year-old girl seems to have been missing. The CID now expanded its manhunt beyond the borders of the British zone.
Among other things, a poster campaign was carried out in all 4 occupation zones. That was very unusual, even for 1947. 50,000 posters were then distributed. That's a huge amount. And also contact with the police authorities in the other occupation zones was made, and in other states that were then developing, to maybe find out who was this person.
Inquiries were even sent to the state criminal investigation offices in the Soviet-occupied zone, without result. Cooperation between East and West was becoming increasingly problematic. In many cases, cooperation was no longer politically desirable.
In 1946 and 1947, it became apparent that the inner German section was becoming more and more entrenched. There was talk of trizonesia, as the three Western zones were referred to, and the Soviet-occupied zone was already splitting away more and more.
Nicht nur an der alten Grenze Deutschlands, auch an der Zonengrenze im Harz werden jetzt nach gründlicher Ausbildung Polizeistreifen auf Skiern eingesetzt. Nicht jeder ist ein geborener.
The fact that the borders between the sectors were often inadequately secured did not make police work any easier. Smugglers and unofficial border crossers had an easy time of it.
Trotz des Schnees wechseln täglich 80 bis 100 Personen illegal über die britisch-sowjetische Zonengrenze. Schmuggelware und steckbrieflich gesuchte Personen müssen abgefangen werden. Die Polizei auf Skiern soll deshalb zur besseren Beweglichkeit der Grenzstreifen im Winter dienen.
Those who could not, or did not want to show papers at the official crossings, preferred to cross the border undetected. This was particularly easy in the Harz Mountains. The remoteness of the confusing forest area between the British and Soviet zones made border crossing easy. Even for Rudolf Pleil, a serial killer.
From about the summer onwards, Rudolf Pleil offered himself as a border guide, a role urgently needed in such a confusing area as the Harz Mountains, in order to find the border at all. And often the people who wanted to get from one zone to the other were not necessarily familiar with the area. They were strangers there and needed someone to guide them. The victims of Pleil who could be identified were mainly young women who had to cross this inner German border for various reasons. They were very often women who were engaged in black market trading or smuggling, who in any case were carrying goods that could have aroused covetousness. It wasn't clear exactly why Pleil killed. On the one hand, he was portrayed as a sex offender because he mainly murdered young women and also allegedly committed sexual acts on them after their death. But he also robbed the victims.
In 1950, Pleil, who had murdered at least 12 women in cold blood, was put on trial in Braunschweig. He boasted of countless other undiscovered deeds, calling himself the greatest killer of all time. The Hamburg investigators took note. Was Pleil the rubble killer?
There were quite a number of serial offenders at that time. It's actually known that such situations always attract serial offenders. You can see that very often after the First World War, for example, or during the Second World War. There were many series of murders, especially robbery murders, also in connection with sexual acts. The serial offender Pleil was even brought to Hamburg and shown the crime scenes and asked whether he had possibly also been active in Hamburg, in quotation marks. And Pleil said, no, he'd never been in Hamburg, but it would have been a welcome excursion for him to get out of the penitentiary where he'd been serving time. And that was an example of the classic serial offender, Pleil.
Das war der klassische Serientäter beispielsweise, Pleil.
In 1958, the murderer hanged himself in his cell. The mystery of the dead in Hamburg remained unsolved. For years to come, the rubble murders would keep Hamburg investigators busy, but they would never be solved. The identity of the victims remains unknown, as does that of their killer.
You'll never find out. No one knows. If someone seriously wanted to commit such a deed, then it was no problem at all to hide people in these ruins, and quite a few were guaranteed not to be found either. There was a high level of insecurity, but this high level of insecurity was not only due to the crime rate, which was certainly higher than anything comparable, if you can put it that way, but it was the general living conditions that also reinforced the impression that it was really very, very dangerous just to survive.
The struggle for the well-being of one's family became the primary raison d'être of people in those post-war years.
Der Gegend, wo wir waren, war jeder nur froh.
In the area where we were, everybody was just happy and grateful and compartmentalized, and really only had interest in their own family or their own environment.
Wenn Sie zwei Kinder haben, die 13 Monate auseinander.
When you have two children 13 months apart, where the second one was born when the first one couldn't walk yet, you know it can only be about that little family, that one got fed somehow and got clothes.
Wie auch immer, und was anzuziehen kriegte.
For years to come, people had to cope with hardship and deprivation and live on their wits. The anarchic conditions of the immediate post-war period soon became legendary.
Now man became a wolf to man, it was said at that time, because it was a time in which one fought mainly for one's own pack and with relatively wolfish means. And the wolf always appears in two manifestations, as part of a pack and as a lone wolf, as an outcast or disturbed wolf, which then attacks the lambs. That's really a form of mythology of social behavior that played a huge role in the post-war period. On the other hand, of course, the wolf is also a figure who has tremendous social intelligence and actually makes sure that he doesn't take it too far. In this respect, I don't think that, despite the enormous war neuroses that the post-war period exhibited, the psychopathological perpetrator played such a huge role. Actually, this post-war generation was a relatively unremarkable one in terms of policing across the board.
Eine polizeilich dann relativ unauffällige in der großen Breite.
How many murders remained not only unsolved, but completely undiscovered during these years will never be known. Post-war society was reorganizing itself and looking to the future. It was an ambivalent time, full of contradictions, in which mourning and hope, exhaustion and the will to get on, fear and joy lay side by side. The circumstances under which Germans reinvented themselves in this post-war period would shape the country for a long time to come.